she caught him reaching. These houses were just little lanes between. You could walk between it, but see, and so he would just open the window on his side, open the window on her side, and reach in there and get what he wanted.
Okay.
And they run him out of town, and they closed the church, so we didn't go to the church anymore.
I am recording. You can go ahead.
Ready to go? All right. Well, we'll get started. Okay, so let's start first by having you say and spell your name.
My name is Leatris Faye Beamer Reid. Boehmer. It's pronounced Bamer. And I was born in North Dakota in 1930.
Just before we start on that, I just need to get the date on here, make sure we have everything. And so we're recording this on August 27th of 2013.
Okay, August 27th.
And we're recording it at your home in Walla Walla.
Okay.
So let's have you talk about your family and how your family came to White Bluffs.
First.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. Do we have to start over?
No,
We're good.
My name is Leatris Faye Beamer Reid, and this date is August the 27th, 2013, and I came here in June to White Bluffs, Washington in 1935 or 36. I'm pretty sure it was 36 because I had my 6th birthday there.
so it would be best if you were to address Bob as opposed to the camera. But,
Okay.
Bob, can I get you to scoot that chair
Sure.
over just a foot or so?
Yep.
Get a little less reflection in the glasses. There we go.
How's that? Better?
That's a great picture
Okay.
now.
All right.
And just look at him.
All right.
Okay. So you said you were born in North Dakota and moved to White Bluffs in 1936. Why did your family leave North Dakota and head to White Bluffs?
Well, we had a terrible depression, as you know, and I was a depression baby, and we just simply weren't. There was no work, there was no money. We just simply had to get out of there. We lost a little boy at 2.5 with what they call membranous croup at the time, but it was actually what it was that awful kids have it. It's asthma. Terrible asthma. And he just couldn't make it. And I think it just broke my mother's heart. She had just lost a baby. So then I became the baby. But I was almost 6, so she had written all over Washington and Oregon because she knew that there was fruit there and there was food and the temperature was reasonable. And so she wrote all the little towns that she could find in Washington and Oregon to find out what they did there, what they grew, and what the chances were of people surviving. And she got one from Mr. Ryerson that owned the grocery store in White Bluffs, and one from the man who had the bank, and I can't remember his name, but she got glowing letters about fruit. She got glowing things about that there was work. There was packing sheds, there were alfalfa fields to take care of, and there certainly were. They didn't stint on it, and it was not exaggerated.
I need for you to put the papers down. We're getting that. This microphone is very sensitive.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe I can put a chair or something next to you. So
No,
you
this is
can
all
have
right.
them
This is
handy?
all right. This is all right.
Okay.
I'll just put them down here.
And,
As good as I
and
can.
when you need to reference them, then that's fine. But as you're speaking, then
I know.
yeah, it comes to a very sensitive mic. which is great for our sound, but bad for notes. Go ahead.
Okay.
So that's how we came to be there, and find it we did. It was exactly like they described it. It was probably the best thing that ever happened to us, because we would have starved. We had no money even to pay for that little boy's doctor bill that we left. So then I was the littlest one, and we had 6 left.
And so, talk a little bit about your parents and your siblings. What are your parents' names? Your siblings?
Well, my oldest sister, who I dearly love and still is alive, and I'm glad, is 10 years older than me, and her name is Dorothy Lorraine Bamer Foraker. And she lives in Everett, Washington, and she will also probably make a statement to you. But she's my oldest. And then I had a sister, LaVon. I had a sister named Helen and a brother named Virgil. All of them, same name, Bamer. And I had a little brother. I had a sister named Arlene also. And she didn't live at White Bluff. She stayed with my great aunt and uncle in Minnesota because they had no children and they wanted to educate her. She was very smart. And she had been treated badly at school in North Dakota, and she didn't want to go back. And they were visiting us. So my mother said, well, you could have her for a year. And of course, they became so attached to her, and she loved them dearly, and they were good to her. And they did visit us in White Bluffs, and they liked White Bluffs when they came. But it was the best thing that ever happened to us to move to White Bluffs. We had work in packing sheds, like I say. The kids were very receptive to us, and everybody there just opened their arms.
I wonder if you could describe the place you lived in White Bluffs.
Well, we lived at Lulabelle Johnson's house, and we were buying it from her, but we never realized any money out of it when it sold to the government. But Lulabelle Johnson had a son named Ford Johnson, because Lulabelle Johnson was a niece of Henry Ford, who made the automobiles. And we stayed there at that house, and it was wonderful. We had good neighbors, fruit orchards all over. When they said that you will find all the fruit you want, they really meant it.
And so what sort of fruit was on the land that you were at? We grew alfalfa. If you didn't grow alfalfa, you grew fruit. But we had a good well on our land, and alfalfa was a good paying crop. And of course we had a cow, and if we had too much alfalfa, we could sell it. So it wasn't something that went bad. And the fruit, every kind of fruit. First time I ever tasted cherries or even seen a cherry tree was there. Or ever ate an apricot or seen an apricot. Or even apples. We had apples there, wonderful. And the whole valley was full of that. It wasn't just one little orchard, it was lots of orchards. It was covered with orchards. And alfalfa fields. Yeah. Did you have electricity on?
We did. First time we had electricity. We had electricity shortly before we moved from North Dakota, because I remember my mother had a Maytag washing machine that she had just bought and paid $2 a month for. So we had that all packed up and ready to go, and our tickets. The government gave us tickets to get out of a depressed area, and we took the Empire Builder, brand new, to Spokane, and came into White Bluffs on a fruit train with our little parcel of stuff. And they welcomed us with open arms. And they
So you mentioned there was a well. Is that how were your crops irrigated? Was it?
Oh, well, we had sprinkler systems. They weren't like they are now. But we had what we had. You dug a ditch across the field, and then you made little rows out of that on both sides, and you would run it from the well pipe into that big main ditch, and then you would take the little ditches and close them up. When you got enough irrigation water, you closed them back up, and that's what we did. That's how we did it, and that's how they watered the orchards.
And how about running water? Did you have?
We didn't have running water in the house. We went out and got it by the bucket full off of the well. There was a little faucet, and you could either pull it up with a bucket or you could turn the faucet on, and there was a pump. It's the same one you watered the yard with. But it was grand to have all the fresh water you needed, because we paid 25 cents a barrel in North Dakota for drinking water because it was so rancid and acrid. 25 cents then was a lot of money. We washed clothes with it. My mother would take it after she washed clothes and scrub her floors, and they were white from the lye and the soap. And then she would put it on her garden. We never had bugs on the garden. You rationed it really, really carefully there.
So who were some of your neighbors?
Can I butt in here real quick again? I gotta adjust this mic. Your fine clothing is
it droopy?
no, it's crackling just a little bit in my microphone, and that's no, it looks wonderful. It's just the way that I had this microphone placed. Wouldn't be a problem.
I'm microphone illiterate.
It's that new technology stuff. That should fix it. And go right ahead.
So I was going to ask you, who were some of your neighbors?
Let me see. Beldens. Beldens were one of our neighbors. Summers were some of our neighbors. I can't even remember what his kid's name was. Oh, I can't say his name. He kind of talked with a nasal, and my dad called him Snazzy Summers, because I don't know where that came from. But anyways, he had a crush on my sister Helen, and Helen didn't like him. Of course, she was only about, I don't know, 12 or 13. I don't think she had boys in mind. She was kind of a tomboy too. They were some of our neighbors, and we lived. The Abercrombie place was north of us, and down below us was an abandoned place, and they must have made wine of some kind, because they grew grapes, and the grapes were still there. They grew right down to the water. We would go down and get these great big beautiful Tokay red grapes, and they were right there by the river, so they had enough water. But the whole farm was completely abandoned, probably because of the Depression. I really don't know. But they were the neighboring ones, and the Gurrells lived up above us. Helen and Gerald Gurrell was their name. And Helen Gurrell was my sister Helen's very favorite girl. They run around all the time.
And how about you? Who were some of your best friends?
Oh, Patsy Boardman was my best friend for a while. She was probably my best friend, yes. And she was the granddaughter of the Saths, who were related to the Wheels, who run the ferry. And Ida May probably was another little friend. She was a nice little girl. I liked them all. There wasn't a whole lot of, kids had to go home and go do things, you know. It wasn't, you know. And I remember the Killian children, because they were German, and they came there, I want to say about 37, 38. Hitler was already busy in Germany. And they came home, and Mrs. Supel used to raise sheep. Her and her husband, they were German also, very, very German. Nice people. But she thought Hitler was doing such great things over there for the German people. And so Mr. Killian went over and had a long talk with her and said, you know, you are putting yourself in a dangerous position, because this is not going well in Germany. He might be doing things for the German people, but he has things in mind for the world. And I thought, how kind, how provocative and kind that was. It wasn't necessary for him to do that. He really didn't know them, but he had heard things, you know, and in a little community, things like that get around. It isn't gossip, it's just fear. But I thought that was very kind, and I was only about 7, 8 years old.
I was going to ask you about, did you have certain chores or responsibilities
Always.
that you had to do on the farm?
Everybody did. Everybody did. Mine was feeding the chickens and gathering the eggs. And we had a little hen named Grandma that Mother picked out of the shell, and Billy Rooster, who I guess was named after me. He turned out beautiful, but little Grandma hen was sterile, so she must have been too weak. But she kept her in the warming oven for an extra couple hours, and she picked her out of the shell, and she was sterile. And she would run around stealing everybody else's chicks. She would have a couple of Rhode Island Reds, and she would have a couple of little Leghorns, and maybe a little barred rock or two, and she'd huddle them up, and boy, she'd fight them off. She's going to keep these kids. Well, Mrs. Sath was such a sweetheart. They lived in the next to us, and she brought my mother some duck eggs, white Peking duck eggs. And she said, why don't you just set her? She's dying to set, and she doesn't know. She'd fight them off. And so they set about 10 eggs under her, because duck eggs are pretty good sized. And she hatched out every one, and she's so proud of them. Oh boy, she'd just stomp around that farmyard like she really knew what she was doing. And she took them down to the horse trough one time, and they found the horse trough, and they jumped in, and oh, she just went berserk. Come back, come back. And so it got to be a morning thing. Every morning she'd take them down the horse trough because they had to have their swim. But she raised them. Those things were fun things. We didn't have TV. We had a little tiny radio that we could listen to for the news. But it wasn't a thing you had on all day. But Billy Rooster used to hear the music, and he would try to keep up with it. My sister Dorothy would always do the lunch dishes, and she'd say, Billy Rooster, are you out there singing to this music? It was very wholesome.
What other sorts of things did you do for fun?
Oh, the river. Oh, the river. The river was a godsend. We learned to swim. First summer we were there. And we had a raft. The dads had got together and built this big raft. And if you could swim out to the raft, I was not supposed to, but I did. And the little Lao boy wasn't supposed to either. He was just learning to swim. And he went under. And my sister Dorothy was a really good swimmer. And he went under for the third time, and she went down and got him. And got him out on that, pulled him up, and there was a couple of guys up there and pulled him up on that raft, and they turned him over on his stomach, and the water just poured, and he lived. But he wouldn't have lived. And every one of those kids at White Bluffs were just as devoted as that to the river. That was our playground. We had to do our work in the morning because it was cool enough. And the summers over there were, boy, they were hot.
Yeah.
But we could go in and get in the swimming pool then, in our swimming pool.
You mentioned a little bit ago having a radio. Did you have a telephone also?
We finally did have a telephone, and it was only $1 a month. That was right uptown. We'd never had one of those before. It was a party line, so you had to, if there was an emergency, you had to give up the line. If there was an emergency, if you didn't, they would take your telephone out and you'd never get a telephone again. So that was good and responsible. And I think Mrs. Westling was a telephone. She had it in her home. She had, her and her daughter, I believe, operated it. I'm pretty sure. They lived up by the bank. I remember that, but I can't tell you. We didn't have names on the streets that I know of.
And so did you get your news mostly on the radio? Was there a newspaper also? Or?
There was a little newspaper there, and I believe it was for Hanford and White Bluffs, and my brother actually worked for that newspaper man. First he started out just because he thought it would be fun. Phil asked him, he said, would you like to know something about publishing a newspaper? And so Dutch went and worked for him. That's what we called him. We didn't call him Virgil. And he went and worked for him, and they did publish a little newspaper. It was a weekly, just once a week. And of course they had all the ladies' aid, tea parties, things like that, things at the church. Everything was in there. Yeah. A little gossipy paper. It wasn't malicious, it was just who had a luncheon at their place or whatever. And so when he got older and came out of the Army, he went and took formal newspapering. Went to college and took it. And he became a newspaper man. Boise Statesman was one of them. And he went down to California and he worked down there for a while. About 10 years there. So that was good for him.
You got started in White
Yeah,
Bluffs.
yeah.
What businesses do you remember being in White Bluffs?
Well, I remember Ryerson's Grocery, and I remember around the back of it was a little creamery where you could, in fact, they picked up a can of cream at our back porch every morning. Because we had, by then, 2 cows. And one was a Guernsey and one was a Jersey, and they both have lots of cream. So we couldn't use all the cream, even for 6 kids. So they would come and pick that up, and my sister Helen always did the ironing. She liked to iron. That was her job. And so he would come, and here she'd be on that back porch early in the morning, starting the ironing. And he says, I don't think you've gone to bed. You just kid her. But that was what she did, and she was excellent at it.
So there was Ryerson's and the creamery.
And the creamery, and there was a little garage back there, and I can't remember the name of it because we didn't have a car. But there was a little garage back there, and there was Pop English's drugstore. Everybody knew where that was. Pop English and his wife had no children, but they owned this little drugstore. And they made the best ice cream in the world, and he sold it there. And you could have an ice cream cone for a nickel. I mean, it was an ice cream cone. And a dime was a double dipper, and it had two shells, and then one cone. It went down to 1 cone. And that was a dime. And it was hard if you had a dime to decide whether you wanted to do that or not. I remember my mother used to give us 2 pennies for Jesus to take to Sunday school. And I always put one in. I figured Jesus wouldn't care if I had a rope licorice from Pop English's. And years later I told her, I said, Mama, if I would have known that Jesus didn't want my money like I do now, he wants our love, has nothing to do with my 2 cents, I would have brought you home one. She says, your Sunday school dress was the messiest thing ever. She says it always was covered in black. And she says the rest of the girls, I could just press the back of that little white dress and with some water and make it good for next Sunday. And she says they could wear a Sunday school dress for all month, and she do. But she says, I never knew that. And I said, well, if I would have known better, which I know now, you'd have had one too. And by then I was about 47 years old.
Talking about the school in White Bluffs, school? How large was it? How many students you think there were, and any of the teachers that you remember particularly?
I would say that in my first and second grade class there was 18 that I can name off, that I can remember. We had a little boy come there named Carter House, and I think his father was something to do with engineering. Allard. Sam Allard kept the irrigation system and the electric thing, and I think Mr. House had something to do with it, but we had never seen a child look like this before. He looked like he stepped out of a catalog. He had this blonde, beautiful boy, had this little blonde hair all cut so nice, and he wore little argyle knee socks and little short suit pants and a little white shirt and little flaps on his shoes, and I thought, my gosh, that's the cutest little boy I've ever seen. And of course, he didn't know how to share. And one day I was swinging on the swing, and Alice Moody looked out the window, and here was this little boy grabbing that swing and taking it away from me. And she says, "We don't do that here." She says, "You have to wait your turn." She says, "When Leatris is done with it," she says, "you can have it. It'll be your turn." But they were probably nice people. It's just that they weren't white blood oriented.
And so, you want to talk about Alice Moody a little bit? She
was a wonderful teacher.
Is that right?
Wonderful lady. She taught first, second, and I believe possibly third. And there was probably, I would suppose, 18 in the first grade, and probably close to that in the second, and then there was the third grade. And we did not have separate rooms, but we had little petitions that she would put up so that we would keep our attention. And we didn't have monitors. Everybody helped everybody. If there was a little boy that needed help with numbers and somebody was good with it, she would assign them to help that child. It was probably the most together community. If something was unfair on the playground, it was put a stop to right away, sometimes by the children. And teachers, if they were in their room, they kept a window open in good weather, because if there was anything wrong on the playground, it was either reported or taken care of. And I can't remember fights on the school. I can't remember that. Ever. It would never have been tolerated.
How did you get to school? Did you walk?
Oh yes, everybody walked. No, the only children I remember that came in on a bus, what was his name? Mr. Fisher's school bus. Mr. Fisher, I believe. And he came in on a little bus with a little bus. And I think they were probably from out toward Saddle Mountain and farms like that, because they had to go to school. But I do remember a little bus, and I don't even remember that it was painted yellow or anything. I think it kind of reminded me of maybe a van, but it had windows in it, and it was kind of squared, But it seems like it was dark gray.
And so how far was the school from your home?
Let me see. We had to pass Sass Orchard, the whole length of their orchard, and then Belden's, and then we had to walk across the front of Belden's, and their Belden's was pretty good sized. And then we had to walk up past Summers's up the hill to our house. So I would suppose it was probably a mile. And some of them walked a lot more than that. And Mrs. Moody used to bring kids in with her when she came to school, because she drove to school. and she was around the reach, it's the last reactor. And Old Town used to be there. The whole town used to be on the river at one time. But they moved it away because I think they were progressing. People were moving in, spreading out, and orchards were filling in, and I think that's why they probably moved the town. But we had a movie theater. And somebody from the Tri-Cities came over with a movie. In the summertime, we had a movie once a week. Probably in the evening, early, about 7. And then in the wintertime, it was kind of hit and miss, whenever they could get over or whatever. I don't know. I can't remember. But we did have movies there.
Do you remember any movies that you saw there?
No, I wouldn't remember that. I probably wouldn't have even understood it, you know. But it wasn't anything that was offensive because they didn't do that.
Where was the movie theater in sort of relationship to some of the other businesses?
Okay, across the street from Ryerson's Grocery, and also across the cross street where the railroad came to fill the cars. That was right across the street from Ryerson's Grocery as you come into White Bluffs. Then there was a main drag. And there was a railroad hotel there because they had railroad workers that when they went out to do things to the railroad, you know, the rails out there, they had to have people. And they also rented to other people if they came in and there was a room empty. And it was right across the street from Ryerson's Grocery, from this one that's burned off. And behind there was a building, and that's where they had the movie theater. And it was just an old building. I don't know, it had seats in it. Not wonderful, but seats, you know. And then they had a balcony on it, too, so that was good. The kids would go up there, and of course, you know, one time we had some holy rollers in there that rented it. And they were rolling around on the floor, and my brother and his buddies were up there taking toilet paper, throwing rolls down there, and they were all in little, I don't know, rolling around. Spirit moved them, I guess. Boy, they got in trouble for that. But it was used for a lot of things. You know, if they had a community meeting or something, they either used it at high school or that little building, depending on what it was about. Sometimes it was a farm meeting or a new spray that was coming out, or what they should do and shouldn't do. Or
I was going to ask you about any community events you remember, either picnics or 4th of July things or boat races.
Boat races we had right there. They did not start in Tri-Cities. They started at White Bluffs. It was wonderful. Mr. Killian used to slice his big watermelons and sell them for 5 cents, and Pop English used to sell his ice cream cones, and the Ladies' Aid always had something going, cookies or something, or a bake sale. And it was just a fun time. And we had a band. They'd gather up a band and have music there. It was pretty good. And in the spring we always had a little May Day thing, and we had a maypole. And they would twine the strings around it like they do, you know. And we had a program, quite a program at the high school. And we had one that we were in that was the doll dance. And Alice Byers was supposed to be the French lady who had the dolls. And so we had these cute little dresses on, little ballerina type dresses, and she would come around and wind us up. That was the first start of it. And we danced to the tune, the doll dance, start of it, old tune. And each one of us, she wound up and we started dancing. And we would dance around this maypole. And that was part of the program. And we had, I remember my sister had a reading. I want to live in the house by the side of the road and be a friend of man, is the way it goes. And each stanza ends with that. And my mother tutored her, her teacher tutored her, And at the end of every one of those stanzas, when she got up there, I want to live in the house by the side of the road and be friendly with men. Brought down the house, of course. And when, oh, my mother was so embarrassed. She was so embarrassed. So when she had, later in life, when she had a beautiful garden and a family of her own, I found that on a plaque that you put out in your garden, an open book with this on it in a plaque form. And it said, I want to live in the house by the side of the road and be a friend to man. I said, this is for old memories, Helen. And she laughed. She had a good laugh out of that.
You mentioned earlier going your Sunday school dress. What church did you go to?
Well, I think at that first we went to the Presbyterian, but then they closed that. But then we went to the little Lutheran church, I think, was up in back of the bank. And we went there for a while. But my dress was always a mess. I come home with licorice all over it because, of course, I had to stop and take one of those pennies, buy licorice at Bob English's drugstore.
Do you remember any other churches in the community besides the...
I do not. I don't remember that there was a Catholic church there. I don't remember that there was.
I wonder, I know the Wanapum people were in the area. I wonder if you have any memories of the Wanapum Indians.
Oh yes, I don't know they were Johnny Buck's Indian tribe. My brother knew Frank Buck. He had 2 wives. One was old and had white hair, and her name was Deloria, and I don't remember the other one, but they were fine people. They came in and they would gather fruit off the ground because it was ready to dry. They would catch fish out of that river and smoke it and just grab your nose and want you to go down there and have some. And they were just fine people. They came in usually before cherries. You would see them before cherries. And then you would see them every day out in the orchards, and nobody ever charged anybody for that. They could have all they wanted. And my mother actually learned to dry fruit. And oh, that smelled good. Oh, just wafted up and grabbed you by the nose. And they put it in little thin sheets like cheesecloth. They'd make a rack with willows, make a rack, weave it, and put it between maybe stumps of willows, little tiny seedling willows that were coming up. And they would make these racks, and they would put this cheesecloth over it to keep the flies away, and they would dry it. And they would dry fruit all summer long. Peaches, cherries, apricots, apples, everything. And they taught my mother that if you soak them just a few minutes in salt water, they will not turn brown, and they won't salt the fruit. And so she learned how to do that. And the fish. Oh, when they smoked that fish, you want to go down there and just have some. It just smelled delicious. They had a mixture they mixed up to put on it so it wouldn't dry it out. And they would take the whole bone out of it. They'd slice it. They'd take the scale off, the skin off, and the ribs out, and they would place that between these same little cloth and dry it. And they would smoke it from beneath, and they'd keep that just really low. Oh, and you could smell it all over the valley. You just, oh. And it was delicious. They did a good job. And they were interesting people. And you know, it was a good place for kids. I remember my brother used to go up, 14, 15 years old. Him and his 2 buddies, Leo and Louis Russo, Leo Goodner and Louis Russo. And they go up to Saddle Mountain, take a little flour and a little baking powder and maybe some salt and some lard. And they'd go up there and stay for a couple days. Nobody thought anything of it. There was a little spring up there, and it was always green. And they'd just camp out and snare a rabbit or whatever. They just loved it. It wasn't usually went in good weather, yes, but we didn't have bad weather in the summertime. But you wouldn't let a 14-year-old kid out now, 3 of them all by themselves, you know? But they had wonderful times, and it was a good place to raise kids, and it was a good place to be raised too. Really good.
I want to ask you about the sheriff.
Oh, Roy Bean was a fine man. I think I told you about him coming to get the boys to take the...
You did before we started recording.
Well, he was a deputy sheriff out of the Tri-Cities, and I think the main office was up at probably Yakima, I'm not sure. But he had two little girls, and Roberta went to school with me, and Loretta came along later. She was younger by a couple of years, but he came to our house one morning, and we were just up. Dutch wasn't up yet, my brother. But he said, I wonder, is Virgil up yet? And he said, no. He said, but I'll go get him. He said, what's he done now? And he says, he's sure going to get it if he's gotten into trouble. And he said, now, I want you to understand. He says, there's nothing going to be trouble about this, Joe. He says, I want you to go get him up. He says, his 2 buddies are in my car. And he says, we're going to go do a little favor for some people. And he said, I don't want any repercussions about this. I don't want any questions about it. If I hear of any beatings about this, he says, I will deal with it. And my dad went in and got Dutch up, and he came out and got in the car. He was dressed, and they went up to the packing house, which is right across from Ryerson's Grocery. And he says, now we're going to go get that car that you pushed down this incline last night and release the brake. And he says, we're going to push it back up that slight hill. It was probably down there about 7-8 blocks. Well, it was uphill now. It wasn't so easy. But he says, I'll help you with the brake here. And he said, we'll keep this released. And he said, we'll push this back up. So he got those 3 boys, probably 14, 15 years old, to push that car about 7 or 8 blocks up to be iced. And he came home, he was pretty sweaty and he was pretty tired and he wanted some breakfast. But nothing was ever mentioned about it. And he was a fine man. He knew how to handle people. And he wasn't out there to bully anybody or... And later he came to a family reunion. We called him up and invited him because we knew he lived in Milton Freewater, him and his wife. And of course Roberta, I kept track of Roberta because she moved here. That was his oldest daughter. And so I was glad to meet them, and we invited him to the get together, and he mentioned that and he laughed about it to Dutch, and Dutch was a little uneasy when he thought we were going to invite the Beans. And I said he made a good joke of it. He says, I've used that a lot of times, and he said, on how to and how not to. And he said, you turned out pretty good. He says, turned out pretty good.
Someone else I wanted to ask you about, when we were talking earlier, you were mentioning a man named Ellis Johns.
Oh, Ellis John was an interesting person. He lived down in Old Town in just one of the abandoned buildings. He had been on some kind of a merchant ship. And somebody on that ship that worked with him attacked him. And he was beating on him, and he killed him. And so they sent him to a penitentiary. It was kind of an accidental killing. He didn't mean to, but he was really, that's what I got out of it. But he lived there. He came to White Bluffs because it was such a nice little town. He came through there and he liked it. And he was an artist, a real artist. he did pictures of people, and he would make a few bucks, you know, did paintings of them. And when I had my 10th birthday, my mother used to leave vegetables and fruit on his porch because she knew he didn't have a garden. And she always left vegetables and fruit if we had extra, because we always had extra. And on his porch, because he was kind of a little recluse, but he would come out and talk to you. He was pleasant. And when I had my 10th birthday, my folks bought Muriel Belden's girl's bike for me to ride, and it was a smaller bike. And he painted roses on the fenders of that blue and white bike. And I had the prettiest bike in town when I moved to Walla Walla. So I always remember him because I was fascinated with him. In fact, I took art in school because I was so fascinated with him. He would sit there and sketch somebody, and I mean, right in front of your eyes, and make it live. And you wondered how he did that. He used charcoal a lot, and pen and ink, and paint. And I always felt bad because his life was kind of wasted there. He could have been, I mean, he could make a likeness of anybody perfectly. But he chose to be there because we accepted him and we respected his privacy. He had been through a lot, and I don't think he was a murderous person. I think it was something that happened.
So when and why did your family leave White Bluffs?
Well, in 1937, Hitler was very busy, and by 1941, he was even busier. And in April of 1941, we moved to Walla Walla. My dad says there's going to be some military. He says, you can bet your sweet life. He says, it's big enough to have some military. And he said, I want to be where there's some jobs. And so we moved to Walla Walla, and there was a veterans hospital here, and he was a veteran. And he said, I just think it'd be better. Because they had surveyed our area in 1937. 36 or 37, I'm not sure which. But we kept surveyors at our house, so we knew they were surveying for something. And it took them, a couple of years to survey all that area that they were looking at.
But you didn't know what they were?
They didn't even know what they were surveying for. They were hired by the United States government, and they were employees of the United States government. So we kept Mom and Daddy Red, we called them, and they were nice people. They had no children, and they just loved us. She taught us really good things that we hadn't learned from our mom. You know, Mama didn't know how to make fudge. She'd never had that much sugar to spare in her life. So we all learned how to make fudge and panucci and good stuff from Mom Red.
So you knew they were working for the government, but you didn't?
We didn't know. They didn't know. But they were there about, I would say, 2 years. So I associate with the Manhattan Project because it's so logical. Hitler was busy. Oh boy, was he busy. So I don't know.
Right.
It might have been, it might not have been. We thought it was an irrigation project. We were so excited because an irrigation project, we were so given us more. See, you could have irrigated more land. But
so how old were you when you left White Bluffs?
I had my 11th birthday here. It was in the spring of 1941.
So what?
And we didn't have war until 1941, December 7th.
So as a 10 and 11-year-old girl, what did you think of leaving White Bluffs and moving to Walla Walla?
Oh, I thought I was going to die. For one thing, they had a Holstein cow at Margaret Stearns's, where we lived in her little house when we came here. And my father took care of her yard and milked her cow and separated the milk. It was a Holstein cow, and it's like skim milk. I didn't drink milk for a year. I couldn't handle it. I mean, we had cream on top of the milk, and then we sold half of it to the little dairy. And I said, this is what we slop the pigs with. I'm not drinking this. And they worried about me. I wasn't drinking milk. But it was probably better for me, but I wasn't used to it. I wasn't used to it. The Scandinavian blood in me calls for that milk with the fat in it.
Did you keep in contact with people from White Bluffs after you moved here to Waterloo?
I knew Bonnie Morse was here, and her sister Ruth, her sister-in-law Ruth. They were both Morse girls. And I don't think they were sisters, I think they were cousins, because we had 2 Morse families there. But Ruth went to school with my sister Dorothy at White Bluffs High School, and I went to school with Bonnie Morse, who went to White Bluffs Grade School. And I'll tell you what, I was sure jealous of that girl. She could do handstands and cartwheels all around the White Bluffs Grade School and not stop. She could do a flip over and throw herself up and come down on her feet. And I was just amazed. She was a couple years older than me, or I thought she was, but I don't think so. I think she was probably close to my age. She probably was 1 year. But she was a fantastic athlete. Even the boys envied her. I mean, she could just flip around like a circus performer. And here I was, a tomboy, but not delightful with things like gymnastics. There's always somebody we envy when we're kids.
So in 1943, a couple years after you moved away, the federal government came in and
cleaned out
said,
everything.
Yeah, had to leave. Did you hear about that from people?
My sister was living there.
Oh, she was. Okay.
She was living in the Johnson place. She said nobody ever came and got the beautiful antiques that she had upstairs. She had a teapot that came over on the Mayflower. It had the legs it was a silver teapot, and the legs were actually worn completely off. And it had the Ford name on it.
So which sister was this then?
That was Dorothy, my oldest sister that I love so much.
And why had she stayed there?
She stayed there because she had a husband who was a truck driver, and she was expecting her first baby.
Oh, okay.
And didn't really know what else to do. And he was gone.
Was someone she had met in White Bluffs then? What?
She met him in Kennewick. She was working at Kennewick General Hospital at the time. And she met Vern Foraker, and they got married at our house. In fact, we chivaried them at our house. And that was probably when I was 13 when I was an aunt. So Colleen was born in 43, and she wasn't born there. She was pregnant when she was there, but she was born after that. And that's when they moved them out. They had to move everybody out. And I always wondered whatever became of Mrs. Johnson's beautiful things. Because they were museum things. It should have been in a museum. They shouldn't have been in an attic.
Right. Where did your sister and her husband go then when they had to leave?
Well, they went back to Kennewick. And Colleen was born in Kennewick. Then she came to Walla Walla, and she had a little boy a year or 2 later. She had 4.
Have you ever gone back to White Bluffs
We
on a tour or
went.
any of those?
We went to the Hanford White Bluffs picnics, I think 4 or 5 times. And then, of course, the people who were doing the arranging for it, Annette Hereford and I can't remember the other boy. I can't remember the boy.
Algerson?
I believe. They graduated high school with Dorothy, and they just were getting too old to do that. It was a hard thing, and people were dying off. But Alice Moody was at the last one I was 2, And I loved seeing her. And I knew her immediately. She looked just like herself, just exactly.
So when you went to the reunions, they usually was a picnic, right? At
Mhm.
the park, Howard Ames Park. Did you also do a tour
We did.
back?
We did. We could take our car in. First time, I think they had a bus for people who had no transportation, because the Tri-Cities had, you know, they were old. Some people weren't driving anymore. So they evidently acquired a bus for some that couldn't, and whoever had room in cars, we took them, but ours was always full because our kids were just fascinated by this. And we went to the dinners, the little banquets that we had, you know, and Mr. Ryerson was there.
What did you think when you had a chance to go back and see the land, the area where?
Broke my heart. Just broke my heart. We had a hard time finding. We wouldn't have found where our house was, except there was a water tank associated with this pump, and it sat out front. It was made, and everybody, a lot of people had them. Some of them had brick with a liner in it, but this one was cement, and it was kind of cone shaped. And evidently it was a holding tank for the house, or whatever. I don't know. I'm not sure. But it was there, and that was still there. They hadn't knocked that down. That's the only way. And it's set up on a hill. It was the first row of hills as you came down toward the river, dropped down to the river to Old Town.
Okay.
And so that was how we found it. But there wasn't any stumps of trees left. There wasn't anything left. They actually had the crew of conscientious objectors at McNeil Island come down and cut the trees and the wood out of there and took it back for fuel by truckloads. So and that was at the last, just before they were already starting to build. But, you know, the reactors and things, and dig the systems underneath,
Right.
and the storage thing under the... But it was a wonderful place to grow up, and I don't know that they'll ever get it cleaned up.
Anything that we haven't talked about yet in terms of White Bluffs, any stories or events that stand out that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
I just think it was the best place in the world to raise kids, because it was a community spirit that I never saw favoritism. I never saw belligerence about minding rules. I always saw a humanitarianism. If you knew that your husband or your neighbors or anybody was having a problem, you didn't make it your business. You didn't gossip about it. It wasn't unusual. It was more of an empathy, more of a sympathetic, let's do what we can for them. I never saw the malice toward anybody because they were poor or maybe did something wrong. If there was a wrong committed, it was straightened out and talked about by the two people that did it, and it was left alone. And they had a tavern there. And even there, it was not tolerated for people to act like a bunch of savages or fights. Or it was a place to go have a cold beer if you wanted one, but I don't remember a lot of drunkenness, or I don't think he would have. Harry somebody was his name. It ended up two people owned it, but I can't remember what their name was.
Oh, the tavern.
And we were gone, but they told us about it, and I can't remember. But that was the last of it. And it was just a little tavern. It wasn't, I don't know. There's probably 4 or 5 little tables and maybe a row along the bar. I remember standing out there one time because my dad went in to have a beer with a friend. And I said, well, I'll wait out here and eat this ice cream cone from Pop English. I knew what to do with it. He was a fine man. He actually organized the White Bluffs band,
Oh, right.
the high school band. And he made room for everybody. Everybody had, Aloha Meeks could do the baton twirl, and she taught 2 other girls to do that. And they had white pants with a it was either black or navy blue stripe down the side, and a white shirt, just plain little white shirt. Girls wore a white blouse, and everybody had a part in the high school band. And they went up to Yakima, and they took first place. That little bit, competing against Kennewick, Pasco. It was amazing. Somewhere we have a picture, and I don't have the picture. I can't find it. But Dorothy just loved it. She played a drum, and she just loved it. And they did a good job. No, it was a fine place to grow up. And it was sad because it really was a neighborhood community. And there were people who had plenty. I mean, there were well-to-do people there. But they didn't flaunt it. They were no different when they went to the Grange meeting or whether they were entertaining. There was not any class distinction. And especially at school, I noticed it. That's unusual. That's unusual. And we welcomed it.
Well, I want to thank you very much for letting us come here and talk to you today and for sharing.
Well, you use what you can. I know you'll cut because, of course, you can't. You have to do what you have to do. But I know that people are going to give you some wonderful stories. Stories about how they were accepted. And I'm sure every one of those people that you interview will tell you the same thing, that it was a wonderful community.
Thanks again very much. Appreciate it.
I appreciate your coming.